and I've been there for 7 years. This is, well, 8 years now. And this is my first time at ACTC, and I've had an amazing experience, just a lot of great presentations, and I am just very happy to be here. I'm chairing this session, and I present first according to the schedule, and I will be followed by Daniel, and then there's a third presenter who is not on the session yet. Hopefully he will join us at some point. And we will go through the papers and then have some time for discussion at the end. My paper is titled "The Plague as Ethical Crisis in the Iliad." I'm a modernist by training. I don't teach. I teach the Iliad in one of my courses, but I don't specialize in the classics. So this was a great exercise for me to write this paper to learn more as I studied the topic of what I'm about to discuss. So I will pull up my document and get started. In a 1987 article, Daniel Blickman argues that the plague incident at the beginning of the Iliad sets up the ethical paradigm for the rest of the poem. I was intrigued by this thesis. It was stated on the first page of an article to which I didn't have access entirely, so I decided to write my paper on this thesis and speculate on my own how this might be true. So in this paper, I will contend that the function of the plague is to replicate on a small scale the way the mechanistic forces of fate entrap the human heroes in an inescapable cycle, uninterrupted even by sacrifice. Peter Paik discusses the predicament of individuals trapped in the machinations of pagan fate. They are placed under the sway of archaic forces that are irresistible, powerful, arbitrary, vindictive, and capricious. According to Paik, fate violates even the will of the gods, to the point where both gods and humans are trapped in this repetitive mechanism of fate. What drives humans into the hands of fate is their unchecked passions and desires. Agamemnon loses Chryseis, true, but there is no good reason for him to take Briseis from Achilles. He could simply wait for the next raid and the next prize to supplant the lost one. It is, however, his unchecked desire for primacy of status, his need for preeminence, and fear that by losing his war prize, he might be lowered in the eyes of the Greeks that drives him to commit an injustice. Instead of waiting to make a future claim, he wants recognition now. Desire, strong passion, according to Paik, are a kind of fate because unchecked love and passion are akin to madness for the Greeks. Therefore, Agamemnon's desire and pride open him up to fate because he is no longer in control of himself. It is in the Greek epic, strong passions, therefore, are dangerous. In the Christian paradigm, the antithesis to this kind of passion is renunciation. It is the way we overcome passion and we receive redemption. Another Homer scholar, Matthew Clark, makes an interesting argument about the endlessly proliferating cycle of insult, punishment, and reconciliation with a perpetual leftover remainder in all of the episodes of the Iliad. He argues that the epic is made up of incidents triggering other incidents until the very end of the poem when the ending itself is left unresolved. When the narrative finds a way to secure a release from these merciless and inhuman powers of repetition, it is temporary and never complete. Each release holds within a remainder that has not yet been atoned for and which restarts the mythic cycle of insult, punishment, reconciliation with yet another leftover remainder. There is a cycle of retributive events at work in the Iliad that endlessly proliferates the need for retribution, revenge, restitution, or reconciliation. As Clark notes, one problem leads to another, but the conflict which it produces continually grows beyond the boundaries of reconciliation. As I show next, the epic revolves around the first existential dilemma recorded in Western literature, a dilemma premised on anxiety and anguish over the point of human existence, implied in the question, how can one be free in a world dominated by the impersonal mechanisms of fate? Matthew Clark argues that the plague incident in the Iliad is a little epic that encapsulates the plot pattern for the larger epic, which repeats itself in a nested form over and over. The episode of Chryseis contains the first crucial incident, which is embedded and subordinated to the larger plot. The microcosm structure of this incident mirrors the plot of the whole poem. The incident goes like this. Agamemnon captures a woman in a war raid, Chryseis. She's the daughter of Apollo's priest, Chrysis, who pleads with Agamemnon for the return of his daughter. Agamemnon refuses, and Chrysis the priest supplicates Apollo for the return of his daughter. Apollo sends a plague over the Achaeans, who receive the message that Chryseis needs to be returned to his father, and Apollo must be appeased with many sacrifices for the plague to stop. This is done accordingly. Agamemnon loads a ship with the liberated Chryseis, 100 bulls due to the god, and Odysseus in charge of carrying the cargo and completing the sacrifices. The plague ceases, and many Achaean lives are spared. There is a kind of resolution to the plague incident, but even though this incident is concluded, it gives rise to a new conflict. Agamemnon is deprived of his war prize, and he takes Achilles' prize, which stirs Achilles' rage and eventual retreat from the war, which itself causes a whole new chain of fateful events that leads to the death of Patroclus. In the world of myth, the individual is subjected to constant conflict with no view of a final resolution. Animal sacrifices briefly create intermittent periods of respite, but not in a way that contains and offers any ultimate reconciliation to the conflict. Therefore, mythic violence begets and perpetuates mythic violence. Fate triumphs over individual attempts at freedom in a relentless and inescapable cycle. At this point, it is worth noting that wrath, rage, and anger are driving forces for the storytelling. The epic begins with the injunction for the muse to sing, quote, Achilles' rage, black and murderous, end of quote. Achilles' anger is in reaction to injustice, but underlying the anger is also a diffuse anxiety and malaise that has to do with the fact that Achilles cannot be free to take charge of his own fate. Rather, he is forced to submit to Agamemnon's decision. Apart from renunciation or exercising detached, cool reason, his only recourse is to retreat from the battle and sulk and stew in poisonous resentment. Achilles is therefore in the thrall of a passion that constrains him both from acting, constrains him both from acting and speaking. Take note via Kierkegaard that the force that compels one to be silent in a manner that forbids self-reflection is itself mythic and demonic. The demonic in this regard is the anxiety that drives the individual away from freedom and agency and into a state of despair. Quote from Peck, the individual retreats into himself in a subjective stance that Kierkegaard calls enclosing reserve, which is defined by muteness and the refusal to enter into any communication that may bring into its psychic horizon the prospect of freedom. The demonic, as Kierkegaard defines it, is unfreedom that wants to close itself off. But the fact that the individual cannot completely seal himself off dooms him to a state of ceaseless agitation in relation to the outside world, end of quote. Achilles is such an individual trapped in a cycle of anxiety manifested as anger and mute resentment. Even though fate is inexorable, the individual's anxiety in reaction to fate provides both the trap and the exit from it. Achilles' wrath forces him into retreat and silence. But the same anxiety and anger triggers the compulsion to narrate, which starts the plot of the epic. As Peck notes, quote, the one genuinely free act left is to tell the story of one's fate. But such an undertaking is impossible for one to achieve so long as one remains within the realm of mere life. For under the horizon of mere life, one cannot speak without causing the elements of demonic ambiguity to proliferate and multiply, end of quote. In Achilles' case, his attachment to a form of revenge through resentment and retreat from the battle and his larger community renders his actions and behavior increasingly ambiguous, since he is obliged thereby to take recourse to shifting justifications in order to deflect the claims of his fellow Achaeans who need him in the battle. Without breaking out of a despiritualized conception of himself, Achilles would discover that his efforts to recount his tale of being wronged are reduced to a sterile exercise of empty self-justification, in which he engages in the episode known as the Embassy to Achilles. His need to justify his resentment leads to the death of Patroclus, which further entraps Achilles in this vicious cycle of fate from which he attempts to break free. At this point, I would like to note that anxiety, guilt, and ambiguity stifle freedom. The ambiguity stems from the potentially infinite proliferation of meaning elicited from each action and word, specifically from the individual's realization of his impotence to contain, master, and overpower the proliferation of meaning that turns around and to entrap him. Anxiety is a byproduct of ambiguity, and with anxiety and ambiguity comes the unspecified and diffuse feeling of guilt. Another quote from Paik: "It is in guilt and anxiety that the powers of fate manifest themselves in the psyche, in which the postponement of one's undoing becomes the only alternative to suffering, punishment," end of quote. The demonic ambiguity, anxiety, and guilt can only be transcended if one rises above the demands of mere life and mere survival. Thank you. Next, we have Daniel Palm, and his paper is titled Plague, Civil Discord, and Human Nature in Thucydides.
Thank you. I've always enjoyed reading and discussing the segment on the plague with students. They find it quite interesting, and it's nice that it comes so early in the book, so it does kind of grab them and keeps them going through the discussion of the long haul that Thucydides is. I had originally planned in this paper to write on the plague and make some comparisons with the political discord that appears in Book 8 at the end of Thucydides, where there's in 411 BC, there's the coup d'etat by some of the friends and allies of Alcibiades. But I ended up not doing that because I found so much material to write about in the plague section itself that I thought there was no need to do that. So let me proceed. Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War includes the author's famous observations and reflections on human nature, human behavior and emotions during wartime, most notably his observation about fear, interest, and honor as, quote, the three strongest motives. In this paper, we consider a significant non-military incident, though certainly one that was related to the war, involving the democratic population of Athens, namely his discussion of the 430 BCE plague in Athens in Book 2. Within his account, one sees a range of emotions and behaviors similar, sometimes identical, to those of the Athenians at war. We inquire, what might we gain from Thucydides' vocabulary and observations about Athenian democracy, and ultimately about human nature? Thucydides' account of the plague follows immediately after the conclusion of Pericles' funeral oration. He writes about the plague thematically in several identifiable sections, divided by translators typically into separate paragraphs. Our author begins by noting its outbreak and the stark rapidity with which it claimed the lives of those stricken and the physicians who attended to them. No human art, he writes, was helpful, and supplications to the gods declined until the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put a stop to them altogether. A second brief segment mentions the plague's suspected origins in Ethiopia, as he says, above Egypt, but concludes with Thucydides admitting he will leave speculation as to its origin and its causes to others, perhaps suggesting that finding the starting point of, quote, so great a disturbance, unquote, may not be possible to accomplish. What he can do, having experienced the disease firsthand, is to, quote, simply set down its nature and explain the symptoms by which it may be recognized by the student, unquote, reminding his readers that his intention with this work is to teach. From this point, Thucydides proceeds to offer an extended and detailed description of the plague's effects on the human body, with the disease causing for most of its victims a prolonged and miserable death. Is the plague, in effect, nature waging war on human beings? It was, he writes, quote, almost too grievous for human nature to endure, unquote. There is something at least baffling and extraordinary about it, an apparent unnaturalness that distinguishes it from ordinary disorders, as he says, manifest in that the scavenger birds abstained from eating the plague victims' corpses as they would with unburied battlefield casualties, and eventually disappearing altogether from the region. And yet, he has stated that the disease has a nature. Its victims die almost on a schedule, as he says, on the 7th or 8th day. It followed a pattern felt first in the head, thence proceeding through the body. It has particular identifiable effects that can be observed and described, and that with some minor variations are seen repeatedly among its victims. In a fourth segment, Thucydides details the emotions and behaviors he observed among the Athenians during the plague. Most terrible, he writes, was the dejection and despair of the victims when they realized their condition, their resistance to the disease disappearing and bringing on a more rapid death. Add to this, he writes, quote, the awful spectacle of men dying like sheep through having caught the infection in nursing each other, unquote. And despite their fear, a word that appears several times in this section, Athenians were still drawn to assist their dying neighbors, honor causing them to be unsparing of themselves in their attendance in their friends' houses. There is compassion as well, but he writes that it is a compassion that is connected to a sense of honor, with the greatest compassion offered by those who had recovered from the disease and would not be affected a second time, at least not fatally. Thucydides notes these survivors' elation, with some becoming unnaturally overly confident. As he writes, half entertaining the vain hope that they were for the future safe from any disease whatsoever. Thucydides returns in a fifth segment to treatment of the dead, already referenced in the third section. The high infection and mortality rate results in the living, the dying, and the dead side by side, in homes, on streets, and in the sacred places. He writes, burial rites were entirely upset, with some resorting to, quote, the most shameless modes of burial, unquote. With respect to the living and the dead, the plague removes all social constraints and barriers. As he writes, for the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. In a sixth and final segment, Thucydides describes, quote, lawless extravagance owing to the plague, with men doing now, quote, just what they pleased, coolly venturing on what they had formerly done only in a corner, unquote, living and spending as if there were no tomorrow. About their property, their tangible interests, they no longer care. As well, honor was in that terrible moment redefined. He writes that it was settled that present enjoyment and all that contributed to it was both honorable and useful. Finally, the plague removed fear among the Athenians, not the fear of death, but since death appeared inevitable, the ordinary fears of the gods and their city's laws, they've disappeared. He writes, fear of gods or law of man, there was none. If interest, honor, and fear are the primary motivators of human action, the plague, in Thucydides' eyes, appears to have eliminated or removed from the Athenians' consideration each of the three, with people informed and motivated by their passions alone. I think it's not too far from the truth to say that during the months of the plague, Athens is more or less governed by human passions. Thucydides concludes his account with a reference to a poem, as he writes, which the old men said had long ago been uttered. And the poem is this: a Dorian war shall come, and with it pestilence. But there arose a dispute among Athenians as to whether the word was indeed, in that poem, was indeed famine, limos in Greek, or pestilence, loimos. This is a note from the Crawley edition, the landmark Thucydides that I was using. So this question, was it actually famine or was it pestilence? With Thucydides noting that the people chose the latter term, making, as he writes, their recollection fit in with their sufferings. To this, he adds that if another Dorian war should come accompanied by famine, the verse will probably be read accordingly. This is his one skeptical comment that I noticed in the section about his Athenian countrymen. One notes in this discussion that while Thucydides hints at the plague seeming almost supernatural and causing at least some Athenians who had survived to imagine they are endowed with a supernatural guarantee of good health, he does not seem to take these claims seriously. There is for Thucydides a natural world, and the plague is a part of it. It is one highly unusual aspect of the natural world, and it has its own nature. In the end, respect and fear for law and social conventions, care for one's own interests, good citizenship, piety, each of those will return when the plague has run its course, and the passions will again be ruled and not themselves governed. Thucydides says nothing in his account to suggest that democratic Athens reacted differently than would the citizens of a non-democratic regime. But he appears to have recognized something of the health risks that come with urban life. While the plague, as he writes, committed its worst ravages in Athens, it also terrorized others of the most populous cities, but did not affect the more widely dispersed Spartans and peoples of the Peloponnesus. As he writes, at least not to an extent worth noticing. But his discussion of the plague is remarkable for its democratic character, taking little, if any, note of class distinctions among the plague victims, and including no references to distinctions among citizens, slaves, or foreigners. The plague is indeed a great leveler. Any human in its path is a potential victim, and there is no escaping death. To conclude, while he does not refer to the plague as causing people to descend into barbarism, we may infer that the behaviors the plague brings result in the temporary disappearance of civilization. The polis offers individual people the safety afforded by a well-governed regime with gods, traditions, and laws in place to restrain, guide, and govern the human passions. But as human beings learn time and again, beneath our civilized veneer lie hard truths about the human condition that pandemic, like war, can reveal. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We will open the session now for discussion. If anybody has questions.
There we go.
Oh, please, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say they were both lovely papers, and you know, clean and you know, just nicely written and argued. I'm interested right now in commonalities and differences among these various plague texts, the different authors and different time periods and all, because I'm working on a project that David is also involved with, a book project, and it just continues to astonish me how many similarities that there are from one narrative about plague to another. I attended the Camus session, I guess it was yesterday, on the plague, his La Peste. And there were, again, the same sort of things They come up with Defoe, Journal of a Plague Year, and any number of other plague-related things. And I noticed that I think Camelia and Daniel, you both were talking about human nature. Camelia, did you use that as well?
I focused on passions. Yeah, so kind of the same thing. The
Similar.
unchecked passions. Yes.
Right. And of all topics, it seems to throw you right back to that again and again. Is there such a thing as human nature that does not substantially change over thousands, literally thousands of years, from Thucydides' time to what's going on this very hour in our time? And I know, literature frequently makes us ask this question, so I know there's nothing original about that. But I've been struck at how very quickly these plague texts bring us to that point. And so I was just going to ask you both to comment, and our other colleagues here, Jay and David, to, is it the topic itself? Is it just the very nature of, this life and death situation? Or is it something else? I don't know. Could you all comment on it?
I can go first, Camelia, unless
Sure.
you'd like to.
Sure, go ahead.
Either.
Yeah, for me, I think in reading this again, I get the sense that Thucydides is interested in the extreme situations that human beings encounter, and most notably war and plague. But I think you could include famine, as you mentioned in that little item about the poem, and also times of economic disruption too. It seems to me that he realizes that when human beings encounter extreme situations of difficulty that involve death or big financial loss, that people start behaving in some of the same ways. They do panic along similar lines. They do experience despair and despondency. And that whole idea of throwing caution to the wind and just spending freely. And I love his little statement. People did things in public that they previously would have only done in a corner. And I didn't give it too much thought, but it did seem to me that the past year and a month or two, we have seen people in various ways behave along similar lines. So yeah, I think it does seem to me that he recognizes all these extreme situations of great difficulty. They are of a piece. They're kind of along the same lines, and they bring out the same problems that human beings have.
It makes you think of I immediately thought of the people dancing around in Florida, inches from each other's faces, dancing around provocatively,
Right.
in spite of what's going on.
Sure.
Yeah. I like the phrase used of extreme situations. Danielle, you just used that phrase because I focus in my paper on there's this repetitive cycle of disasters in the Iliad, but I've also heard this theme throughout the conference, particularly in one session in which one presenter made a list of disasters that we have experienced in the last 2 decades, and there's just disaster after this. So not a plague, a pandemic necessarily, but so many other disasters. And it seems like in the natural world, if we want to focus on that, which for me, I describe it as the mythic world, the world of fate. There's this repetitive cycle that is not broken. It's just temporarily suspended. So it might return to a new normal, and then there will be another disaster. And it's just this, it seems that in the natural world, we're entrapped in this mechanical cycle. And I think what I was doing with Achilles is to bring up this existential question. If we stay in this mythic world governed by fate, in which the cycle is not broken by sacrifice, in the Christian redemptive view, the sacrifice of Christ interrupts that cycle, then the question becomes, what is the point? I mean, there's no freedom ultimately. We're just trapped in this machine that kind of just creates cycle after cycle. And I guess unchecked passions, if we don't have that Christian narrative of renunciation and sacrifice, I guess unchecked passions would make sense, right? Because what else is there to give people agency over their fate?
I loved it, and then I'll give somebody else a chance. I love that concept that you brought up of in the Greek structure of the epics, but particularly in the Iliad, of the remainder, which is almost mathematical, David, that everything these cycles get started again because there was just that little remainder from the previous equation. If you could get rid of the remainder and have a zero, then we'd be clean. Everything then we'd be in heaven. But there's always that nagging remainder that starts the next cycle. And it's particularly evident in the Iliad. This insult is going to be remembered and start the next thing, and Patroclus is going to be dead, and then we're going to get Hector, and it just goes on and on.
Yeah, and there's a need for radical interruption of the cycle, right? And I don't want to make an apologia for unchecked passions, because even the Greeks had recourse to reason, right? So Achilles didn't need to resort to just resentment and anger. So yes, I'll return the conversation to Daniel if he wants to talk more about how the democracy and the use of reason and the police would put a check to those passions, or else if anybody else wants to jump in.
Yeah, just what I see in Thucydides is I think he understands and speaks to the polis as a place where you do have the gods, you do have the laws informing human behavior and putting limits on the passions. And those are, necessary things. But, it is striking in this section how he says, people just realized taking sacrifices to the gods wasn't doing anything, so they just stopped doing it. And paying attention to the laws, a lot of them thought, why should I bother? They did things in public that were probably against the law and against social convention. So they just lose the plague causes them to lose their inhibitions and their respect for both the law and the gods. And he also says this thing really gruesome about people using sloppy burial habits. Burial and cremation for the Greeks was, of course, a big deal and had to be done properly. But people are just losing all their inhibitions about that too. Just taking the corpse of a family member and tossing it on the funeral pyre of somebody else that hasn't started burning yet, or throwing it on the pyre of somebody else's that's burning right now. So it's really kind of a nightmare scenario that he shows us.
Defoe does a lot with that too. And to bring out your dead, the cart going by and people throwing the bodies on. And some of it, of course, is necessity, but there's also something wrong, a slippage in human morality.
Right. And
the people who are the worst off are forced into that job of body collecting and so forth. And of course, they get sick as well.
An example that I would bring up, because my major field is French, but I also work in Scandinavian. And perhaps you've seen the well-known film by Ingmar Bergman, The Seventh Seal.
Mhm.
And I think it fits in exactly with this model you're talking about, Paige, and has some interesting aspects to it for the discussion. I think in particular, this notion, if you know the film, Max von Sydow plays this knight who is returning to medieval Sweden from the south.
Mhm.
And so you get this exterior, someone coming in from the exterior, returning home. And then I think one of the most striking images anywhere in cinema is the playing chess with the devil.
Yeah,
On the beach.
that's what everybody remembers. Yeah.
And then I think also the depiction, of course, I think those of us who do literature, I teach both literature and film. Film can be so much more striking, or at least striking in a different way. You get these processions of just what you were talking about with Defoe too, of the carts coming through medieval Sweden. And then I think another really telling image that just has stuck with me over the years is the end of the film, where you get the dance of death of the people on a ridge, getting drawn off to the netherworld. So I guess what it would say is, once again, there's, as all of you have been saying, so much in common here with this notion.
I had a question for Carmelia. You mentioned the word ambiguity several times. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, and how that fits in with the overall picture of Achilles and Agamemnon and so forth. Is it laws and traditions that are ambiguous? Is it words from the god? I missed that discussion a little bit. Didn't understand.
Yeah, sure. So I think what I was trying to do, maybe in a more extended draft, is develop this idea of the only way. So if and I'm going to connect to something you just said about how the gods fail us, because I don't know, it sounded to me like in your paper, the laws were losing their power to keep the people in check, and the gods had no power ultimately. So if all that fails, I was trying to think of what else could Achilles have done, and what else can a human do in a world in which you find yourself alone, right? So in a point of crisis, the gods cannot sustain you, the laws cannot sustain you. And where would Achilles turn? And I was trying to develop this idea of inwardness, that you retreat within and you try to find your groundings in a sense in yourself. And but that's it's a very tenuous ground, because there's no reason itself would be, right, for the Greeks would be the ultimate grounding that could sustain. And I think Athena pulls him back when he tries to attack Agamemnon. And so that's kind of maybe the intervention of reason, but it's not enough either, right? Because Achilles still stews in that anger and resentment, because there's that remainder that that needs to be, the balance needs to be restored. And so there's something else needed to restore the balance. So I was trying to develop this concept of inwardness with storytelling, that the only thing left is for Achilles to tell the story, right? And we have in trauma narrative in the 20th century domain of trauma studies, we have this idea that a traumatized person, the only thing they can do is just retell the story over and over and over, and kind of retell the trauma, hoping that they can put back the pieces of the self that was fragmented by the trauma. And I think that's what the epic does, because the epic is really just telling of Achilles' rage. But the ambiguity, I'm using these concepts from a paper by Peter Paik on Kierkegaard, and but it's Kierkegaard's idea that there's something demonic about the guilt and the self-condemnation and the inability to break yourself out of that cycle. So Achilles remains trapped in this cycle of resentment, but it's also guilt because he fails his fellow Achaeans and he fails Patroclus. And so he's kind of trapped. It's just so helpless, the helpless human being trapped in this cycle. That's what I was getting at, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good. And about people being trapped, I remember in the, it's been a long time since I've read the Iliad, but I recall oftentimes there's imagery of people being trapped in nets or spider webs, that kind of imagery that Homer uses. Did that show up in any of your examples?
Not as such, but what this brings to mind is all the people. So if the plague was triggered by the conflict, by Agamemnon's his own unchecked passion for preeminence, right, the desire to be first, then I was thinking of all those people, those poor Achaeans who died of the plague, right? Wow. So there is no necessity there in a sense. As it was in your paper. In your paper, there was a necessity of, you said something about how the natural world is marked. This is kind of an exceptional part of the natural world, but it's there. In this situation, this was not a plague that got started by necessity of the natural world. So that's also disturbing, that there were all these innocent victims of Agamemnon.
I've got to step away just for a moment, but I'll be right back.
I think that the question of what do we do with the remainder is a very interesting one. And I guess two things. First, there is that question, but then there's the question is, what do the survivors do? And do the survivors learn from what their parents learned, or let's say their ancestors learned, or as they were in the moment of horror, or we'll just say, since because of the topic of this panel, what they learned from the plague moment, or can they do something else with that remainder? And I guess I would add, we could start to create a list. I mean, something akin to what Camelia was suggesting, as she could tell the story. I thought you could put on a play. I mean, from the frogs, we know at least that there was a particular frame within which you would say that whatever our plague might be, and by that time they've already sneaked in another response to the remainder, metaphorize it, right? We're no longer talking about this plague on the body. Let's change the remainder and make it a plague on the city, and there are different kinds of plagues or ailments that a polis might have, or and then also the very notion of a soul. Isn't that a way of transforming what's remained? You'll say, yes, these horrible things happen to their bodies, and by all means, let's have some people describe it for us. But then, is there still something that remains? Plato, for one, I think pushes it to the point where he says, let's transform the remainder into the soul. All this stuff, that would lead to a kind of death that would eradicate fear, interest, honor, may even promote, you got it, you better flaunt it right now because there ain't any more. And then there may be a way also to change religion in a way that it can also be seen as a response. I'm thinking of, that it's I think around 420 that the Asclepion was they started construction on the Asclepion right next to the theater of Dionysus. And so I wonder if there are changes in terms, let's say, the development of the cult of Asclepius at this time, that what might have been an attempt to suggest, yeah, religion, it didn't help grandpa and grandma during the plague, but maybe it can help we survivors if we're willing to identify ourselves as a remainder that has a different kind of nostos or loimos than what our dead kin might have had. And of course, philosophy is another cure. I mean, that one. There's actually so many moments in Plato where he'll evoke the term nostos. One of my favorite lines or moments, I should say, in the Thucydides is when Socrates tells us about his, and he uses this word, my nostos. And what is his nostos? It's his eros denos, this fearful, terrible love or passion that he has for asking questions. But again, that's an example of he took nostos, transformed it into something else that could be linked to the soul, right? And then philosophy can be the cure.
Yeah, I was envisioning Achilles as the first existentialist philosopher who in book 9, he questions all the premises of his society of glory and honor. And but
Given that
also
choice, right?
Mhm.
You could go home. You could go home and you'll live to be an old fart and nobody will remember you. Or you can stay and your kleos is going to be spritzing out of everybody's mouth, right?
Yeah, but it could also be mythologized, this remainder, right? Into religion, like you said. And I'm wondering, because in the Iliad, at least the gods do help, unlike in Daniel's, in Thucydides' situation, because once the sacrifices are offered to Apollo, Apollo puts an end to the plague. But again, it doesn't fully resolve the cycle, because then the cycle continues with yet another incident and yet another insult and injury and so on. But I was wondering if civilization, to return to Daniel's paper, isn't civilization an attempt to find answers to these questions? And therefore you create religion and you create the worship to the gods and the burial rituals and theater and metaphors. And then you end up with a democracy and laws, but then that crumbles. So I was wondering, Daniel, if you could speak more to that. Why doesn't civilization sustain them to some degree? If that remainder is co-opted into this kind of response, is this response also insufficient? So civilization is not what is going to save us in moments of crisis?
Yeah, great question. I guess what I feel like I see in Thucydides is the fragility of human societies, that the gods and the laws and so forth are put there for our benefit and our good direction. But they're also fragile and they can only withstand so much pressure from difficult situations. So that might be an answer, that ultimately laws and religion offer only so much. They don't offer an ultimate solution. I think maybe for the ancient Greeks that, 9 times out of 10 or more than that, things are going to go along swimmingly, and you take your sacrifices to the temple and you follow the laws and things work out more or less okay for your lifetime. But when an extreme situation comes along like these, you better be prepared for the human passions to kind of come out on top, at least for a while. That's my first thought on that.
Daniel, I was interested in one thing you said about issues of class and wealth in the Thucydides, that in your observation was that the the disease really does seem to act in this text as the great leveler, and people are not aware of rich and poor.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a dynamic in these other texts that I've been working with, that both things go on. You know, there's a lot of interest in, you know, where the plague came from.
Mm-hmm.
Did the stranger bring it in here? You know, where is this? It came from Turkey. It came from Holland. It came from wherever.
Right.
And they do that in La Peste too, Jay, I think. And there is, of course, you know, the rich are going to die and the poor are going to die, but at the same time, the working against that, the great leveler idea is that, you know, look at our own situation right now and the statistics, you know, that show that the poor are doing so much worse than the rich, as usual. And there's something in these texts that also, you know, seems to go through this movement each time. It's just that in Thucydides, it sounds like, I haven't read it, so it sounds as if he kind of comes down more on the side that you know, the rich and the poor are going to die, and so we're not going to pay attention to money right this second.
Yeah.
Am I overstating that, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I was intrigued by that, and I thought, you know, I maybe I'm missing something that he's not pointing to here. But and you know, I'd love to go over the text with a fine-tooth comb. It's, you know, this section is really short. It's about, you know, 4 or 5 pages long, so it's not something. But it would be interesting to go over it with someone really talented and knowledgeable about classical Greek and Thucydides Greek, which I am not. So to see if there are any hints that he offers there in terms of class distinctions or something. But I didn't see it in just giving it the reading that I did. I didn't see any references to that. Kind of interesting too. It reminds me a little bit of the plague that Moses brings on, or that God brings on the Egyptians. One of the 10 plagues that Moses references against the Egyptians to help get the liberation of the Israelites. And, you know, of course, famously there, it's everybody's firstborn son all the way up to the Pharaoh. So I don't think Thucydides says anything explicitly about that.
There, it's possible to, since it's a directed plague, you know, it's possible, you know, you mark your door and
Right.
death passes over.
Yeah.
But and in something like Defoe, the rich are immediately leave town. You know, en masse. Everybody in London who can afford to leaves London. But what does that do? It spreads the plague to the country.
Yeah.
So, but still, the people out in the country end up being better off than and it's only the rich who seem to get to go to the country.
Right, and of course, in Athens, the wealthy Athenians did tend to have farms and farmhouses outside the city walls, but they can't go to them as easily because they're, you know, the land outside the walls are occupied by the Spartans and their allies. So it's a good point. They would be able to, maybe some of them, exercise that option, but the circumstance of war brings it and compacts them close together.
That brings up another example for me that's maybe a little surprising, that I've done work on 19th century painting, and realism and depiction of nature. And in the mid-19th century in France, when you have the interest that develops in depicting nature, and the oil tubes are developed so that painters don't have to paint in their studio. One of the things that draws them out to nature is cholera epidemic in the city. Same thing, it's a contagion.
Get out there and paint en plein air.
Voila.
Yeah.
I-
Golly.
I have another question for Daniel, but I wanted to stay on this for a moment because for some reason your comment, Jay, reminded me of this notion of the sublime that is very prevalent in 19th century. I can think of a painting, and I'm wondering if there isn't something sublime about the way this manifestation of the awe and terror that a plague creates in people. So even during this COVID, I live in Southern California where the traffic is just unmanageable on a typical day. And I cross a bridge on my way to a walk that crosses the freeway, and the freeways were empty. And there was just something so almost sublime about that side. It's so, and I guess the terror part of it, the awe of this freeway is empty, and the terror part of it, it's due to a situation of crisis, right? So that is able to create this kind of sight. So it just brought to mind that there's something sublime about plagues.
Defoe talks about grass growing in the streets in the middle of London. And, you know, we all were fascinated by, and still are, pictures of Times Square with nobody there in New York. There's something creepy about it, but also beautiful in a weird way.
Yes.
Yeah, Daniel, in your paper, I heard in the first part that the Athenians for a while exercised compassion and honor and put their own lives at risk to help their fellow human beings. And then there was a breakdown. And after that, they became lawless and they engaged in shameful acts. And I missed the point where that breakdown happened. Can you talk a little bit about that shift? What happens there?
Well, good question. I'm not positive that there is a break, but I guess I would expect there would be. I mean, it would just make sense that that people would, you know, at the very beginning, they would try to help their neighbors, but then they realize how contagious the plague is, and they begin to take or be more cautious about it. But he does say that people were kind of compelled by honor to be compassionate, that they did feel a kind of civic obligation or a duty to be compassionate to their neighbors, even sometimes, again, knowing that it's going to cost them their lives or close to it. So, yeah, I don't know if he draws a stark line like that and say, you know, at the beginning people did this, but after a while they did the opposite. But it does seem to me like you would sort of expect them to do that, right? As the consequences of the plague are more widely known, you would kind of expect people to be more cautious and to say, why should I risk my life for my neighbor? Because it's going to put my own life at risk in a very serious way. So yeah, good question. I don't know if he goes that direction. And again, that's an area where somebody with more knowledge of Greek might be able to shed light on it than I am able to. But,
yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering, at what point do we turn from human beings into animals? Is that a natural progression, or is there a radical break?
I mean, the other possibility, which is often explored, is, you know, the good people get better and the bad people get worse. And that seems to be going on in all of these texts as well. It brings out the best in good people. And it would be unusual for a really good person to go become a beast. and the coming and going is also so interesting. And this whole idea of, you know, escaping, getting past a certain line. And in the Camus text, they're obsessed with passes. You know, one of the guys wants to get out of town, and his friend, who's the narrator, won't let him. And you know, cheating. But he's cheating he wants to be with his lady love. So he wants to cheat, but is it, you know, is it a noble enough reason? Oh no.
I would I would ask both of you presenters. I assume that you teach these texts, and I wondered if you have been teaching them in the pandemic. And unlike sort of one of the questions for me, and somewhat with the paper that I gave, was to what extent one chooses to include the pandemic in our teaching and in our reading of text. But I mean, if with something like the plague, I mean, I assume, I mean, it's just there. I mean, you're not going to be able to study the plague and not realize, and it just as with our conversation, it just inevitably brings up our current situation. Have you been teaching it, and do you have experiences with that or feelings about it?
Yeah, I have. In the Iliad, we cover a lot of text in a few weeks. So I didn't spend a lot of time on the plague because there was so much else to talk about. But in another class, in that same class, I'm teaching Luther on the pandemic. Oh. And his response, his injunction to everything that the Athenians were doing the first part of the plague, right? Sacrifice your life for the other, and in the name of compassion. But in another class, I'm teaching a contemporary novel, Station 11, on a pandemic that ends in a catastrophic apocalyptic world. But I have to say that with the Luther text, we had a very lively conversation on what Luther's approach would look like for us today. And yeah, I mean, the students have been immersed in this for so long, everybody had an opinion.
Yeah, the last time I taught Thucydides was during the beginning of the pandemic. So the spring semester of last year, and it's where we switched over to Zoom classes because of the pandemic. So yeah, I recall it was a spring quarter actually at Cal State San Bernardino, where I taught it last. And yeah, the students had a lot to say about it. They they were kind of amused noticing that this terrible tragedy of the plague in Athens had some resemblances already to the pandemic. So yeah, it was that quarter went from I think about April 1st to June 15th. And that was right last year when things were really pretty dramatically bad and a lot of confusion. I think the students definitely saw that. A lot of confusion, people not knowing what to do. Do we wear masks or not? Is that helpful? So yeah. And I look forward to speaking on it again. I'll probably have the class in the fall of this year. And I know, the students will make a lot of comparisons in that section.
You said, Paige, something about good people get better and bad people get worse, something to that effect. And as I was wondering, at what point do the civility breaks down, and even questions of honor in Daniel's paper, even that breaks down. I was coming back to this idea that there's got to be some sense of inward value that sustains you. So it's not just the outward civility that crumbles pretty fast, And that's, I felt like where Achilles was turning to see inwardly, do I have any values to sustain me? And there's got to be some ideals. In Taru's case in the plague, when he wants to break the law in the name of the higher ideal of love, I mean, that can be something, right? That there's got to be a higher ideal that sustains me from the inside, that doesn't crumble in the face of a crisis, no matter how extreme, even in the face of death. Otherwise, outward civility and even honor, if that's just an outward thing that you uphold for the sake of how you're being perceived, in the name of appearances. Otherwise, I don't understand why honor itself would break down, because that for the Greeks was an inward value as well. I'm trying to think through this idea. Did they have a sense of inwardness at all, or was it just an outward thing
Right.
with their values?
You mean
Achilles,
in Homer, or when you say the Greeks, you mean in Homer?
Yeah, sorry.
Achilles always seems to me a very unself-aware person. And I guess I missed some of the self-examination that you're mentioning, Camelia. I mean, I always attribute all the brains to, Odysseus, though they can take an ugly turn. But, Achilles seems to be hyper aware of honor, but in the more reputation than, true honor. But that's just my, long time, started in high school notion of the Iliad.
Yeah, no, I can see him being very rash and impulsive. I was thinking of book 9. He's the only character who engages in introspection in the Iliad. Everybody else, they just do what they do, right? Agamemnon seems pretty foolish as well. Odysseus, he doesn't get a lot of coverage in the Iliad as much as he does in the Odyssey. So I guess there are other characters, maybe Nestor, who gives speeches, who are very articulate in the name of higher ideals. But I don't think anybody does go so introspectively into the point of things the way Achilles does in book 9. That's what I had in mind.
I'm going to look again. That's a good thing to make me read again.
Yeah, really interesting question, Camelia. My sense has always been the emphasis among the ancient peoples was on the outward, the community, honor, courage, justice, all those things involving other people. So much less time anyway for introspection and thinking of yourself as an individual. But, it's a great question. I wonder, if maybe the Iliad holds some really interesting exceptions to that rule, and you see the beginnings of people thinking of themselves less politically and more as an individual. Maybe you see some of the roots of modernity and individual thinking that really show up, I think, in Christianity, right? That you have an individual soul and, you need salvation for yourself. And everything is not simply your place in the polis, but increasingly it becomes a matter of your individual self. So, maybe that's a really interesting thing. Maybe you see some of the beginning points of individualism in the Iliad, in the Odyssey.
Yeah, it's not my original argument. I remember reading an article about that years back when I was preparing to teach the Iliad. And the argument was that he is the first 20th century individual asking these hard existential questions, something to that effect. And that he's questioning the whole system of honor and glory being measured in material possessions and rank. And so he's questioning the outward makings of an individual and trying to find something more substantial in the sense of inwardness. Something like that.
Daniel, I would just say, I think that there is ample textual evidence for a particular kind of individuality in the book of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
The covenant ceremonies in the book of Deuteronomy, everyone has to be involved. So that's why there's a blessing that's placed on Mount Gerizim, and and the curses are placed on Mount Aval. That's so all of the people can walk between the two pieces.
Yeah.
Covenant, it's also in Deuteronomy where you have that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and Deuteronomy is also in everybody's business. I mean, you should think of the covenant when anytime you're making a passage from sleep to awake, when you're walking across a portal.
Yeah. Very good.
Another example that comes to mind from our discussion is, don't know if you know this play by Jean Giraudoux. It's from the 1940s, and it's called La guerre de Troie n'aura pas lieu. The Trojan War will not have taken place. And it is a discussion between Hector and Odysseus looking out over the battle before the battle starts, saying, we could not do this. I mean, we have family, it hasn't started. And with this crush, again, sort of fitting with your emphasis, Camelia, on fate, that it's going to happen anyway. And he writes this in a very bleak period in the 1940s in occupied France.
Yeah, I was really, as I was preparing to, I guess, wrap up my argument for this paper, I had a conversation with Peter Paik. He teaches at Yonsei University in Seoul, and he teaches literature. And I was telling him my argument, and he pointed out, I included this in my paper, which I am still astounded, the fact that fate violates the will of the gods. So there's something higher than everything, and that's fate. So I'm still processing. I don't know what to make of that, but how do you break away from that? There's no recourse to anything if the gods are powerless.
That's right. Well, you have to get into a different religious model, because if yeah, that's the way they set their concept up in the Greeks. Yeah.
So in that conversation of Hector and Odysseus, was it?
Yes.
Then I guess they operate from a different paradigm if they have options, right? If fate is not just by default the way it's gonna go. Right. So maybe they operate from that individual viewpoint where they have some agency in making decisions.
It's sort of creating, I mean, this is right at the height of existentialism too. It's sort of creating that trying to create some kind of space for decision making in the present. I think
that raises a really interesting question in my mind. I don't recall Thucydides referring to fate much, but I'd love to go back and look in the entire book, and see if that concept shows up much. It might in a speech. I could imagine it showing up in a speech that one of the speeches that he offers, but so much of Thucydides is about human choices and human actions, good choices and terrible choices. So yeah, I just wonder if he refers to that at all.
Interesting.
Well, guys, do you think we need to take a little rest before the business meeting, or?
I have really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much, Danielle, for your paper, and to everyone who has attended, and for your interesting comments and questions. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Great job,
Great job,
everybody. Aren't we?
Yeah, and Camelia, I'd love a copy of your paper. If are you posting it, or is it sent to the ACTC some way?
I haven't thought that far yet, but
okay.
I have your
Good.
email address, so we can talk about that.
Good.
Yeah.
And happy to send mine to whomever would want one. So
yeah, they want people to submit, and They're really trying to catch up with all the backlog of proceedings. And they're trying to make it a little more, peer reviewed and rigorous, that kind of thing.
Good.
So that people can use it to get it better credit, career
Good.
credit. So.
Well, a real pleasure meeting everybody, and I hope to meet you in real life maybe next year.
Wonderful. I hope
Same
so.
here.
All right, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks,